The 360 on Energy and Carbon, hosted by 360 Energy. On today's episode, we are joined by Bruno Miller from Air Company. Mr. Miller is Vice President of Commercial Development and Government Affairs at Air Company, a leader in the conversion of carbon dioxide to products including sustainable aviation fuels, SAF, and industrial chemicals. Bruno Miller is a recognized expert in the SAF industry with over 20 years of experience working at the intersection of technology, commercialization, and policy to make commercial availability of low-carbon fuels a reality. Now let's get into the episode with Bruno. Welcome back, Dave, John, and Bruno from Air Company.
Good to be here.
Yes, hello.
And looking forward to our session with Bruno on the aviation industry transition. I'm looking forward to this.
So this episode will focus on scaling sustainable aviation. To kick off this episode, how does Air Company's mission to transform CO₂ into an endless resource align with the broader goals of decarbonizing aviation?
Yes, so aviation has a significant carbon footprint, and most of it, as you would probably agree with, is on the fuel combustion. About 95%, if not more, of aviation emissions come from fuel. So if you want to address that carbon footprint, you need to address the fuel. And there are different ways to do it. You can burn less fuel. And this is where things like better engines, more advanced aerodynamics, right, better technology helps you to reduce that fuel consumption. You can have better operations, be more efficient when flying, especially with air traffic control procedures that allow you to fly point to point without having to divert around war zones or conflicts. And then there is the fuel itself, right? Can we do something about the fuel so that instead of burning fossil fuel, we can be burning something that has a much lower carbon footprint? And that's exactly where Air Company comes in. We have a process that takes CO₂, biogenic CO₂. So this is CO₂ that has been, is in the atmosphere or recently in plants or living matter. And green hydrogen, you turn it into hydrocarbons and into jet fuel with a carbon footprint that is a lot less than conventional fuel. And that's how you then address the carbon emissions of aviation. And I have to say, it's not only Air Company working on this, but there are a number of other companies using different types of materials that also achieve significant carbon reductions. And this is how we envision that we can contribute to decarbonizing aviation.
Thank you for that. I want to ask you a question about the role of innovation in making low carbon fuels competitive, as obviously in aviation. How much of this innovation is going to come from startups, and how much can we expect to see from the embodied players like the big oil companies?
Yes, it's quite a question. And it's difficult to say. I mean, there are smart people everywhere, right? And oil and gas have very smart people. They have the resources, they have the labs, they can do it. Right. But I think what's difficult for them is they also look at their financials, and the fossil petroleum business is a good business, right? So if they're going to invest in a new technology, they have to compare it against what they get in their business today, right? And so we've seen some of the super majors in the last few years. They were all for decarbonizing, and then they said, no, wait, we kind of have to stop a little bit and rethink this. If they want to do it, they have the means to do it. Then come startups, right? The startups are like, we're going to do it because this is our business. And you can see things like the startups eventually become large companies, and then they're doing it, right? And that's a great story. In other cases, you see then an oil and gas major buying that startup or buying the technology and then doing it or partnering. So I think it's probably going to be a combination. I'm convinced that startups are vital in bringing that push and of the new technology, of not being afraid of exploring and trying and doing. But at some point, you want to scale up. And then the scale up question is, okay, how do I do this, right? Is there a way to collaborate with somebody who's been doing this for 100 years and then do it together? I think that's a very interesting conversation to have.
Yes, there could be this future, couldn't you? You could see the oil and gas majors sort of going, let's let all these startups play around with the technology, see what the winners are, and then we'll step in and perhaps buy a license, take the company over, see where it goes. So it's going to be a very interesting future, isn't it?
Absolutely, yes. That thought crosses my mind often.
And I actually think that model happens everywhere all the time, where it's a startup that's the innovator, because
Yes,
the
right.
large companies don't have to be innovative because they've got this cash cow that just keeps on pumping money, and they're not going to change. Why take the risk? Why even make the effort? So
Yeah, let somebody else take the risk.
let someone else take it on. And thank
Right.
goodness for the startups that do that.
Absolutely.
It's a great segue from John's question, and you had noted, what are the key factors in scaling up the air company's technology across the aviation industry?
Yes, so we have small units where we're testing the technology, testing the basic fundamentals, and starting to make product in modest amounts, right, in liters or quarts or gallons, depending where you are in the world, what your preferred metric is. We need to get to tens of thousands of gallons per day or per year. How we get there is by leveraging existing knowledge and capabilities. At the end of the day, the equipment we need, the equipment we use is standard in the petrochemical industry, right? So we know it can be produced. We're designing so that we can use as much off-the-shelf technology as possible. So it's capital, right? You need funding to build these plants. The economies of scale are really important because, these plants, the bigger they are, the more output you have, and then the more you can spread around the cost in production. You need basically the same amount of people to run a small plant than a big plant. And so that's where economies of scale really, really play in. Another significant factor is, let's call it policy and regulation. And let's separate them, right? Because so on the one hand, you have regulation, permitting, quality standards, OSHA rules, health and safety. Those are critical, but also those were created in a different era, right? Where most of these products came from fossil materials, right? So a lot of it is conditioned on that. And there comes our company with you're doing what? Right? So sometimes regulators, so you have to, there's a process of education. This is what we do, and this is why it's better or not as harmful. And so you need to be able to explain it. So that's certainly a conversation. And then we have policy as well. Government saying, well, we want this to happen, and we need to help these companies financially or with other means. And the United States, but in Europe and other countries, you see a lot of support for renewable technologies, wind, solar, geothermal, for renewable fuels. And we really are grateful for those, because you need that seed capital that can help you scale up, right? Friends and family can only take you so much, but at some point, right, somebody needs to start paying those big checks. And that's where policy is helpful.
So can I just follow up on that, Bruno? Has the IRA program, has that been very helpful for you guys in the States for your company? Have you taken advantage of that program?
The IRA, I would say, has been very helpful worldwide, because it has really spurred other geographies,
other countries to do the same thing, step up.
Right. Yeah. Yes, exactly. And the IRA is so vast, right? It has so many sections that, yes, it's been very helpful. It's been great to see the U.S. government actually coordinate with different agencies. There is the so-called SAF challenge, the Grand SAF challenge, that has the Department of Agriculture, of Energy, Federal Aviation Administration working together. And that's pre-IRA, but also IRA just supercharged that.
Fair enough. Now, the last time we spoke, you talked about how I picked up that your regulatory is allowing you to advance this quicker, and I almost got the impression it was quicker than some other jurisdictions. So can you explain to our audience like how the regulatory issue has allowed you to advance your product more as well?
That's a great question. And one good example is the ASTM process. ASTM International publishes specifications for jet fuels, and this is what allows for essentially the fuel to be safe to use on aircraft and existing infrastructure, which, as we mentioned, it's one of the paramounts of the industry. Now, the ASTM process was not used to something other than petroleum, right? So it took a while to get that first pathway approved. It took seven years, maybe longer, and a lot of millions of dollars, right? So that was expensive. Now, we cannot do a new pathway every 7 years. That just doesn't do it. So the ASTM community came together and created that process that is now more streamlined. Now it's down from 7 years, but it still takes a couple of years, 2 to 3 years. So it is a process that has improved, but arguably, is there a way to make it faster? Because, I mean, 2 or 3 years for a startup, it's a long time.
That's a long time. Yes.
Okay, before I ask my question, we often like to explain acronyms. You mentioned IRA, and we should say that's the Inflation Reduction Act, but it always gives somebody in the UK a little bit of a shiver because IRA was also the Irish Republican Army.
Yeah.
And I believe it's also an individual retirement account in the US. We always have to put these things in context, don't we?
Nice.
But I think your point is well made, that it's quite interesting, the danger of getting just a little political, how the present administration has done something like the IRA, and should you have a change in administration in November, it's quite interesting what may or may not happen with processes like that. And I'm not going to ask you to comment on that, because that's getting you to make, somebody in the US making a political comment about the US situation. What I want, the proper question to ask you, is about partnerships with airlines, airports and other stakeholders, and how's that going to contribute to the uptake of sustainable or low carbon aviation fuels?
Yes, no doubt that collaboration is critical and has been critical to get the industry to where it is today. When we started this, it really was a collaborative effort with all the stakeholders I mentioned, the aircraft and engine manufacturers, the airports, the airlines, the regulators. So a good example here in the United States is the Commercial Aviation Alternative Fuels Initiative. Collaboration has been critical to get the industry to where it is today. Back in the early 2000s, we had a great community effort between the aircraft and engine manufacturers, the airlines, airports, regulators, come together. And a good example in the United States is CAFE, that's the Commercial Aviation Alternative Fuels Initiative. Served as a public-private partnership as an umbrella organization to bring all of these stakeholders together. And we would go out to industry or talk to banks or government agencies. They saw that it was not only airlines, but the entire ecosystem. Then people took notice. It's like, okay, somebody has their act together. This is important. And that momentum has carried forward in what we were just discussing about the ASTM process. So these collaborations between all these sectors, what they send is a signal that this is important for the industry. And if we want this industry to grow, this requires work. It's not only something that people know has to be done, but they're happy doing. Because as we mentioned earlier, there is an existential concern in the industry. If these environmental questions are not addressed properly, there could be limitations to the growth of the industry. You need to be aligned along the entire supply chain, from airlines, airports, manufacturers, fuel suppliers, that this is something we want to do, and that we're doing it in a way that is actually going to solve the problem. Right? That's why there are sustainability certifications overseen by third parties, right? It's not aviation industry groups, but outsiders that come and say, look, if you want to be sustainable, these are recommended standards and practices. So just that alignment of standards, of specifications has been critical, and also to signal to the markets that yes, the industry is serious and we're doing it. And then also from a very commercial perspective, right? Going back to what the air company does, right? So we're a small company, startup, and we need to, we lean on partners, like airline partners that we have, our investors, right? They provide credibility to us, but also market. And we're going to be giving them a product that they want. They're making it to the specifications they want to further their business and their mission. And I think also from a personality perspective, how we operate as a company is, we know we have great technology, we have great people, but we cannot solve it all, and we will need others. Flying is hard. You need a lot of parts to come together. There is an ethos in the industry that, yes, we're fierce competitors, but at the same time, we collaborate because we have common challenges.
Interesting response. Thank you.
Bruno, what impact do you anticipate from the widespread adoption from low carbon fuels in the aviation industry? So that's at a high level. And then how does this advance Where's your company going to go in this? Like, how big? Where do you see it scaling? So let's deal with the first part. What is the net economical impact that this low carbon has on the fuel and the aviation industry?
It's addressing a big concern in the industry in terms of growth. And we've seen in other countries, in Europe, for example, where people are having second or third thoughts about flying because of the environmental footprint, right? So there is I think, a definitive market concern from passengers as to something needs to happen here before I really want to do this. I think the sustainable aviation fuels are an answer to that. There's also regulation. There are mandates in Europe now, and other countries have programs that incentivize the adoption of fuels. So to some extent, right, if you have a mandate, you have to oblige, you have to meet it, or you cannot operate. There's also a very practical business reason for these fuels. And then there's the opportunity that creating new industries provide, especially in places that are not traditional oil regions. You have other resources like solar and wind. You can bring industries to more economic opportunities. I think this is a way to help in that respect as well.
It's interesting because John mentioned in our previous discussion, there are a number of colleagues that we work with that won't fly anymore because of this footprint aspect. So I certainly think John had mentioned, and I think Lashanda earlier, that will be a critical piece as we go forward. I don't know if there will ever be a day where they'll say you can't fly because of the footprint. I am hopeful, based on our discussion, that this is going to happen and happen hopefully quicker than people understand. Because I think flying and going to different parts of the world, people start learning and appreciating other cultures that they would never be open and receptive to. It's an education piece. So the next question I wanted to ask is there a sense of where your company could go? The potential revenues, and is there things that you can share, the growth you see in the next 5 or 10 years as an organization? You don't have to talk about revenue because that may be challenging, but the growth as employee base and things of that nature.
Yes, it's so we're a startup, but I guess older startup. We were founded in 2017, so we've been around for some years. We're working on our first larger facility. Yeah, it's going to take a couple of years to have it up and running. We're looking at towards the end of this decade, the 2030, to have a first commercial production. And that's just the reality of the process, right? If we're going to fail small.
Sure.
Right. So let's make all the mistakes now that are relatively cheap. Let's get all the kinks out. And then once we're ready, we build a larger facility and go up from there. This first commercial facility is going to be tens of millions of gallons per year. It's great for the e-fuels. If we get 10 million gallons, it's like, wow, these guys did it. But we need to scale up to hundreds of millions of gallons. And we can get there because the main limitations typically have been on feedstocks. Can you get enough of the raw material to actually feed these facilities? Right? In the previous podcast, we talked about the other pathways. And at some point, people just run out of the raw material. Now with CO₂, arguably we have too much in the world. Now the question is, can you capture it, can you clean it, and can you use it? And the answer, at least for our company, is yes. We can source CO₂ to get into the very interesting amount of the other component is going to be hydrogen. Can we get enough hydrogen? And then capital, right? Where is the capital going to come to build these facilities? That is going to be the big question. So far, there's a lot of excitement in the financial industry about the prospects of e-fuels. People think there is a lot of potential. Still uncertainties on the technology, right? Still development that needs to be done. Time will tell, but from the fundamentals, the prospects are very bright, and it's going to be a matter of the capital going to be there.
Fair enough. David asked part of my question that I was going to ask. Bruno, I'm going to throw in an off-the-wall question. It's interesting about how this is all going to happen in the future, but most of us are flying now. And I'm guessing in your job, you fly from time to time. So my question is, if you are flying, do you buy a carbon offset for your flight or not?
Yeah, that is a very good question, John. Sometimes I do. It's an interesting question because, it's very personal, right? At home, we try to reduce our carbon footprint as much as we can. Now, in terms of flying, is that my responsibility or is that the airline responsibility, right? I'm buying a product from the airline. Why am I paying for that myself? I'm being a little facetious here because the question goes around in the industry, right? Who actually needs to pay for it? Is it the customer, or is it the airline, or is it the fuel provider?
Good response. I was once at a conference, and I think I better not name the company concerned, but I was at a conference and I had to fly from Edinburgh in Scotland down to Birmingham, short haul flight. But I was talking to a guy there who came from an American corporation with a high level of green credibility. He said, "Oh, how do you deal with this? Because everything you just said in the conference, and now you're jumping on a plane." And he said, "Well, you'll be pleased to know that you're flying on an offset flight." And I said, "Well, what do you mean?" He said, "Well, our company's approach is we offset the entire flight, not just for me as a passenger, but the entire flight." And that did spur me into looking at it. And as I said, I'm in the UK, I come over to Canada, and you have a look. What is a good quality carbon offset for a flight? Is it the $50 package that they offer to stick on your ticket, or what? And perhaps in the short term, sustainable aviation fuel will solve that problem. But in the short term, we've got to address that. But I'm really interested with your response there. Whose responsibility is it? And I think, coming back to what we were saying about flying, I think flying, the toothpaste's out the tube. It's not something that we can undo. Yes, there may be restrictions. We might see some jurisdictions putting such high flight taxes on that people then don't do it.
Flying is here. Flying has many other benefits. It's a complex question. And it's how you do the externalities, right, that are not properly priced.
No, they're not.
Not only on flying, but many other
things. We live in a society where we don't tax or price the full impact. This is the thing that many green campaigners want. They want to, we've talked about it in this country, of moving taxation away from taxing people on work and whatever, but taxing them on environmental impact. Unfortunately, what most jurisdictions do is introduce a new tax and keep the old one as well, making the situation more complicated.
Right.
Bruno, thanks for another great episode. To end off this episode, what is the biggest takeaway for our listeners?
Yeah, big takeaway, I would say, is, so from a air company perspective, we're very optimistic about the future. We think being able to take CO₂ and give it more lives is hopefully going to do a contribution to reducing these climate impacts, not only of aviation, but of the other industries that we can touch. And it's an optimism we share widely for the industry. Talking about collaboration, I think that's key. Certainly key in aviation, and something that we really like to promote, and hopefully extends to other sectors too.
Thanks for that, Bruno. John, what's your biggest takeaway?
I think my biggest takeaway, Air Company's not the first sort of technology startup that we've had pleasure of talking to. And it was really beginning to strike me, and my big takeaway is we need some new technical solutions for the future, and they're probably not going to come from the big incumbent players. We're going to be dependent on people who've got an idea and the courage to follow it through and bring it to market.
Thanks for that, John. Dave, what's your biggest takeaway?
It was combined with John and Bruno's, but I'll just restate it. Innovation isn't going to come from the big players. It's going to come from these passionate entrepreneurs that have this desire and need to make positive change in the world. At the same time, these innovative companies need collaboration and assistance and support from people around the whole sector. So it's really interesting, Bruno. We have a roundtable in the automotive industry, and we're trying to create this collaboration with CEOs. It seems to me that you guys in the aviation industry seem like you're really well advanced on that piece. I was really interested to hear how advanced you have in the collaboration. So thank you for sharing.
Well, thanks for another great episode, Dave, John, and Bruno. Have a great week.
It's been really interesting. Thank you for taking the odd off-script question.
That's all for today's episode of the 360 on Energy and Carbon podcast. Thanks for listening. Make sure to check us out on our website at 360energy.net and follow us on LinkedIn at 360energy Inc. Tune in to our podcast on Apple Music, Spotify, Anchor, or other listening platforms by searching the 360 on Energy and Carbon. You can watch the video recording and subscribe on YouTube at 360 Energy Inc. Email us your feedback at podcast@360energy.net or comment on our LinkedIn post. See you next week.